The food at Grandma's house was not just a meal. It was a ritual, rich with smells and tastes that disappeared the moment you left her kitchen. What happened to those strange, wonderful dishes no one else ever made? Pickled beets in the icebox were always tucked behind the milk in a plastic tub that once held margarine, and no one ever questioned it. Grandma made them herself, boiling the beets until her kitchen steamed up like a sauna and everything smelled like sweet vinegar. The jars never had labels and the lids didn't match, but she knew which ones were ready. The rest of us? We knew better than to touch them. They were deep magenta, cold and slightly slimy, like something out of an old science classroom, but she treated them like fine wine. Every Sunday supper or holiday meal, she would plop them on the table like it was the centerpiece. And even if you didn't like them, you took one slice out of respect. No one else in the family made them, wanted to, or even asked how. It was one of those grandmother-specific foods. So strange, so sour, and so personal, it vanished when she did. But if you ever get a whiff of vinegar and old margarine plastic, something in you stirs, something small and sacred. You remember the icebox hum, her hum, and those bright beets she loved more than most people. Bologna and grape jelly sandwiches were an invention no cookbook ever asked for, but somehow in Grandma's hands they made sense. The white bread was soft, the grape jelly overly sweet, and the bologna thin, slightly sweaty, and perfectly folded into quarters. No mustard, no lettuce, no fancy cheese, just jelly and lunch meat, mashed together like some odd culinary dare that only she could pull off. As a kid, you ate it with confusion and delight, wondering why it worked. Outside of her house, it would have been an abomination. But in her sunny kitchen with the ticking wall clock and the floral tablecloth, it was gourmet. Maybe it was her touch, or the way she smiled when she handed it to you, like she knew it was ridiculous and perfect at the same time. She never explained where the idea came from. Maybe it was the Depression. Maybe it was stubborn genius. But one thing's for sure. No deli on earth will ever serve that strange little masterpiece. And maybe that's okay. It belonged to her, to those sticky afternoons and grape-stained smiles. You would not eat it now, but you would give anything to be handed one again. Jell-O with shredded carrots and pineapple was not dessert, and it was not a salad. It lived in its own gelatinous purgatory. Every family gathering featured a mold of it, set out with pride like it was the main course. The carrots floated like orange confetti, suspended in a lime green wobble that caught the sunlight just wrong. Pineapple chunks gave it a tangy sweetness that only made it more confusing. No one ever asked for the recipe. No one ever wanted seconds. But you took a scoop because it was tradition, because it sat there looking festive and ridiculous. Grandma always served it with a little whipped cream, like that would somehow pull it all together, and in a weird way, it did. The texture was unsettling, the taste oddly refreshing. It was the kind of dish that only made sense in the context of her plastic tablecloth and creaky dining chairs. Maybe it was a post-war thing. Jell-O was cheap, canned pineapple was fancy, and vegetables made it feel healthy. Or maybe it was just a dare that became a tradition. Whatever the reason, it was hers. And now, when you see lime Jell-O, something inside you wobbles too. Hand-stirred chocolate gravy over biscuits was breakfast that felt like rebellion. It was thick, rich, and glossy, like someone melted down a candy bar and poured it over bread. No one else in the family made it, and most people you mention it to have never even heard of such a thing. But in Grandma's kitchen, it was the warm hug that greeted cold mornings. She made it from memory, no measurements, just cocoa powder, sugar, flour, and milk stirred slow in a dented saucepan. When it bubbled just right, she spooned it over biscuits so soft they barely held their shape. It was not fancy, it was not healthy, but it was everything. As a kid, it felt illegal. Chocolate for breakfast. But her smile said, "I know." This was Depression-era comfort food, born out of scarcity and turned into luxury by love. You would eat slowly, trying to make it last, as if that sweetness could soak into your bones and keep you warm all day. And when it was gone, the plate was licked clean, not by accident, but out of reverence. Chocolate gravy did not survive beyond her stove, but the memory of it still clings like sugar to the soul. Canned salmon patties with a side of ketchup were never a meal you asked for, but you always remembered. Grandma made them with care, mixing the salmon, bones and all, with breadcrumbs and egg, then frying each patty until golden and crisp. The smell filled the whole house, rich and fishy and somehow comforting. She served them hot, always with a generous glob of ketchup on the side like it was some sort of fancy sauce, and while everyone else wrinkled their noses, you knew better. You knew that taste meant something. It meant thrift, tradition, and pride. Salmon patties were her way of making something special out of a dusty can on the back shelf. They were depression-tested and Grandma approved, soft in the middle, crispy on the edges, and strangely perfect. Outside her home, you would never touch canned salmon, but in her hands, it was a delicacy. Even now, one whiff of fried fish and ketchup can send you back to her worn linoleum floor, her humming voice, and that simple plate of salmon love. No restaurant will ever replicate it. That flavor belonged to her, and to you, as her honored dinner guest, ketchup and all. Grandma would dunk a ginger snap into her steaming mug of coffee, then hand it to you with a wink, like it was a secret only the two of you shared. That little soggy cookie was your golden ticket, an early taste of adulthood passed down in crumbs and warmth. You would pretend the bitter coffee was delicious, mimicking her slow, satisfied sip, even if it made your face scrunch up. It was not just about the flavor, it was about being trusted, included, important. She made you feel like the world could wait just long enough for one quiet moment at the kitchen table. That chipped floral cup, the way the cookie softened just right, it all settled into your memory like a bedtime story she never had to tell out loud. And as the years passed and life rushed forward, you realized it was not about the ginger snap or the coffee at all. It was about her way of saying, "You matter to me." Somewhere between the steam and the sugar, a piece of you stayed right there in that chair, too small to finish the whole cup, but old enough to remember what it felt like to be seen. Cold macaroni tossed in Miracle Whip and peas was not just a side dish, it was a dare. The kind of dare only Grandma could pull off, spooning it proudly onto your plate like it was gourmet cuisine. You stared at the odd mix, lukewarm pasta, that unmistakable tang of Miracle Whip, and mushy peas from a can. But you ate it. Because she made it. Because she smiled when she served it. And strangely, it started to grow on you. It showed up at every family gathering, tucked between the deviled eggs and the Jell-O mold, a dish that felt like an inside joke only Grandma understood. It was humble and a little weird, but so was her love, unapologetically hers. You would never order it at a restaurant or serve it to guests, but when you taste it again, maybe by accident, maybe by memory, you are right back at her kitchen table. Her hands folding the pasta, her humming from the radio, that quiet pride when you said it was not bad. Somehow, this oddball salad became a legacy, not because it was delicious, but because it was hers. And for one scoop of strange comfort, you would eat it all over again. Hot Dr. Pepper with a lemon slice was not a mistake, it was a tradition. You never saw anyone else make it, and you never asked why she did. She just poured the soda into a saucepan, dropped in a lemon wheel, and warmed it like it was a potion meant to cure the winter blues. The first time you tried it, your eyebrows lifted in shock, sweet, citrusy, oddly comforting. It felt like Christmas in a cup, even if it was only February. She would serve it in mugs with worn handles, steam curling up like a memory escaping. It was fizzy and flat at the same time, yet you kept sipping because it tasted like staying up past bedtime. You always thought it was strange, even a little gross, but now you would give anything for another cup. There was something magical in how she made the weirdest things feel perfectly normal, even special. Maybe it was just her way of making you pause, slow down, share a drink and a story, while the snow fell outside. Now, every time you open a can, you hesitate, just for a second, and wonder what it would taste like warm again. Fried chicken gizzards and livers were not on the menu anywhere else. They were Grandma's crunchy secret, hidden in a cast-iron skillet that smelled like Sunday. You would wrinkle your nose at the sight of them raw, but by the time they hit the plate, golden brown, sizzling, and seasoned just right, you were already reaching for the biggest piece. She would fry them to perfection, serve them with a paper towel underneath, and call it dinner with no apologies. The gizzards were chewy, the livers almost buttery, and every bite tasted like something you were not supposed to like, but somehow did. They were greasy, rich, and oddly addictive, the kind of food you only ate when she made it. There was a rhythm to how she cooked them, like a song you could never quite remember, but always knew by heart. You never asked for the recipe, because you thought she would always be there to make them. Now, standing in your own kitchen, the smell of oil and flour makes you ache. You realize it was not just about the food, it was about being fed with love, pride, and tradition. And that flavor cannot be fried up again. She would ball up the leftover pie dough, roll it flat with that old wooden pin, and sprinkle cinnamon and sugar like fairy dust. Then she would slice it into crooked little spirals, roll them tight, and toss them onto a baking sheet with the same care as the real pie. You watched from the stool, eyes wide, knowing those scraps were made just for you. They would bake while the main event cooled on the counter, peach, cherry, or apple. But these little rolls were your treasure. Crisp on the edges, soft in the center, sweet with a buttery whisper, they never lasted long. She called them pie cookies, though they were never in any cookbook. You ate them warm, burning your tongue a little, giggling while she swatted your hand away from the hot pan. They were a side note, an afterthought, but somehow the part you remember most. Those tiny treats said, "I thought of you." They said, "You do not have to wait." And in their flaky simplicity, they said everything she never needed words for. Now, every time you roll out dough, you save the scraps, and remember her with every bite. She'd peel a banana, slice it down the middle, and slather it, yes, slather it, in mayonnaise before sprinkling it with a heavy hand of chopped peanuts. You stood there stunned the first time, unsure if this was dessert, salad, or a dare. She'd call it banana salad, like that made it make sense. You didn't want to offend her, so you took a bite. Creamy, sweet, tangy, crunchy. It confused your mouth and comforted your heart all at once. Somehow, in the warmth of her kitchen, it worked. You'd never seen it on a restaurant menu, and you'd never serve it at a party, but there, in the calm hum of her home, it felt sacred. It wasn't just about the taste. It was about the ritual, the way she'd hum while she made it, the faded floral plate she always used, the napkin folded just so. Even now, if you mention it out loud, people wince. But to you, it was pure grandma. It was odd, nostalgic, and maybe a little brilliant, just like her. And if someone dared to serve it to you today, you'd take a bite, not for the flavor, but for the memory of someone who made weird food feel like love. The TV buzzed in the background with reruns of shows older than you were, and Grandma shuffled in with a bowl of warm, wet peanuts still in their shells. Boiled peanuts, salty, squishy, and steaming, made no sense until they did. You'd pop them open, careful not to spill the brine, and suck the soft nut out like you'd done it 1,000 times. You didn't question the texture, the salt, or the effort it took to get to the middle. It was a ritual, slow and salty and strangely satisfying. She'd pat your knee, smile that toothy smile, and say, "Don't eat too fast. You'll ruin it." And somehow, you listened. The shells would pile up in a bowl nearby, soggy reminders of a snack built on time, patience, and Southern tradition. You'd never see them in vending machines or at ballparks, but you'd always find them in her kitchen or wrapped in foil for the road. They weren't pretty, they weren't crunchy, but they were hers, and they meant something. Even now, when you see a peanut stand on the side of the highway, you slow down, because a boiled peanut is more than a snack. It's a warm hand in yours, Grandma didn't need fancy mixers or sugary sodas. She had a tray of Grape Kool-Aid ice cubes ready in the freezer, waiting for your next glass of tap water. You'd drop them in with a splash, watching the purple clouds swirl as the flavor melted slow and sweet. It was a drink and a show all in one. You'd sip, wait, sip again, each taste a little stronger than the last. She didn't call it fancy, but you felt like royalty. It was her way of adding magic to the mundane. No cans, no bottles, just frozen dye and sugar in a plastic tray with a story in every cube. She'd say, "They're better this way, last longer." And she was right. It wasn't just a treat. It was a surprise in every glass, a slow reveal of childhood joy. You never thought much of it then. But now, when your drink tastes flat or your day feels dull, you remember those ice cubes, bright, bold, and simple. A reminder that sometimes joy comes in frozen purple chunks from a woman who knew how to stretch $1 in a smile. She never let biscuits go to waste. By the end of the week, the dry leftover ones were torn into chunks and soaked in a pan with milk, eggs, sugar, and spices. Bread pudding, she'd call it, though it looked like breakfast gone sideways. She'd top it with a drizzle of thick syrup, homemade, of course, dark and sweet, pooling into every warm crevice. The whole kitchen would smell like cinnamon, vanilla, and resourcefulness. You'd sit at the table, spoon in hand, skeptical but hopeful. The first bite was warm, rich, and oddly comforting. You didn't know how stale biscuits turned into something so soft, but she did. She always did. She didn't need recipes or rules, just a belief that nothing should go to waste. Not food, not time, not love. The pudding wasn't fancy, but it stuck to your ribs and your memory. Years later, when you see a biscuit left behind or smell nutmeg in the air, you remember her. The way she made something out of nothing. The way her desserts whispered stories of hard years and soft hearts. And you wonder if maybe, just maybe, you should let your biscuits go stale on purpose. Liver and onions. You heard the sizzle before you saw it, and by the time the bacon grease hit the pan, there was no going back. The smell was strong, meaty, metallic, smoky, and it filled the whole house. You'd sit at the table, nose wrinkled, staring down at the plate with suspicion. She'd smile, scoop some onto your plate, and say the same thing every time. You'll grow into liking it. You didn't believe her, not the first time, or the second. But eventually, the flavors started to make sense. The liver, rich and iron-heavy, balanced by sweet onions and the salty kiss of bacon. It wasn't kid food. It was grown-up food served to you by someone who believed you could handle it. She never explained it, never apologized for it. This was dinner, this was tradition, and this was her way of showing trust. Creamed corn on Wonder Bread was the definition of a soggy miracle. It came in sloppy heaps, sweet and warm from a dented saucepan, sliding off the crustless square like it had somewhere better to be. Served on one of those faded floral melamine plates, it was always too hot at first, then instantly lukewarm, sticking to your teeth and memory like glue. Grandma would hand it to you like it was a delicacy, and you believed her because everything she served came with that same quiet pride. The bread would collapse under the weight, turning into a corn-sweet sponge, and still, you would go back for seconds. No one else served this. Not Mom. Not at school. Not at diners. It was a one-house phenomenon, and years later, you realized no recipe book would claim it. The slab bacon hit the cast-iron skillet with a snap like thunder. It came in thick-cut strips, bought from the butcher wrapped in paper, not plastic. Grandma would fry it until the edges curled and the fat turned glassy. No measuring, no timing. She went by ear and smell. When it was just right, she would take it out and make white gravy in the leftover grease, stirring until it thickened into something more glue than sauce. That was the point. You poured it over whatever starch was nearby, biscuits, toast, or leftover potatoes. But the real magic was in that bacon. It was tough and chewy and smoky and salty, the kind of cut that demanded your full attention. None of that store-bought, flimsy bacon that shrinks into nothing. This was bacon that stayed with you, left grease on your hands and a warmth in your chest. And somehow, it tasted better when eaten at the little green formica table where the sun hit just right and the day started slow. It was a ritual, not a recipe, one you never wrote down but never forgot. The oxtail stew took all day. Grandma would start it in the morning, clanking pots and humming gospel, dropping oxtail bones into a heavy Dutch oven like sacred offerings. Whatever she had on hand went in too: onions, carrots, sometimes a can of stewed tomatoes, maybe even a splash of leftover coffee. She would season it by feel, never measuring, just trusting the instincts life had given her. It simmered for hours, low and slow, until the meat fell off the bone and the whole house smelled like patience and hunger. By dinner, the stew was thick, dark, and bubbling with flavor so rich you could swear it cost a fortune. But it came from scraps and thrift, built from what was around, not what was ideal. You sopped it up with cornbread, or just a spoon, and nobody spoke while eating. That was the rule. The flavor was serious, the kind that made your eyes close without meaning to. And it was only ever eaten here, at Grandma's table. The applesauce was always pink. Not because of apples, but because Grandma would toss in a handful of red-hot candies while it cooked. They melted into the mix like magic, tinting everything with cinnamon heat and a blush of red. The apples were usually bruised, the kind no one else wanted, peeled with a paring knife until they were clean slivers of pale gold. She would stew them low and slow, mashing gently with a wooden spoon, humming along with the sound of the burner. The smell filled the house with sugar and spice and something older, something warm and human. It never needed sugar. The Red Hots took care of that. Served warm or cold, usually in a chipped porcelain bowl, it was more than a side dish. It was a memory, every single time. No store-bought version ever came close. Too smooth, too bland, missing the spark. This applesauce had texture, heat, and soul. It tasted like fall and second chances. And every time you make it, you still throw in those Red Hots, hoping to bring her kitchen back to life for just one more afternoon. The eggs came with a crunch, scrambled soft and yellow just like you asked, but with something extra folded in, saltines, crumbled right from the sleeve. No warning, no explanation, just that is how Grandma made them. The crackers softened a little in the pan, but not too much. They added texture, like edible punctuation marks between bites of egg. You always wondered where she learned it. Was it a depression trick, a regional thing, or just something she invented one day and stuck with forever? She never said. But it worked. It turned plain scrambled eggs into something you looked forward to, even if it felt a little strange. There was comfort in the oddity. She would serve it with black coffee and grape jelly on toast, and nothing about it made sense until you were sitting there, halfway through your plate, realizing you would miss this someday. Like everything else from her kitchen, it did not belong in a cookbook. It belonged in a moment. And once it was gone, you knew you would never taste anything quite like it again. Baked Spam with brown sugar and pineapple rings was a crown jewel on Grandma's Sunday table. She always studded each slice with a clove like it was a holiday ham, gently patting on brown sugar until it shimmered. You could hear the sizzle in the oven, smell the caramelizing sweetness filling the kitchen, and see that glossy canned meat becoming something sacred. It was the kind of dish you laughed about later, but devoured in silence at the table. Every toothpick was placed with precision, every pineapple ring carefully centered, and no one dared skip their slice. It felt like a meal made from war rations and love, canned meat transformed by ritual. Grandma swore it was just something quick, but it felt like an event every time. You can still taste that tangy, syrupy glaze. It never looked right anywhere else, and maybe that was the point. Molasses and butter on hot biscuits was Grandma's quiet version of decadence. She never measured either. Just eyeballed the spoonful of dark syrup and dropped it into softened butter with a flick of her wrist. When she stirred it together in that chipped little bowl, it looked like marble, smelled like burnt sugar, and spread like velvet. She would ladle it onto fluffy biscuits that steamed when torn open, and it would melt down the sides in a sticky golden ribbon. This wasn't a modern spread from a plastic tub. It was earthy, deep, and a little bitter, just enough to remind you it was real. Grandma said molasses was good for the blood, but even as a kid, you knew this was about more than vitamins. That flavor carried something old, something strong, something sacred. Grocery store syrup never came close. This was the kind of sweetness that came with stories. Wilted lettuce salad was the only salad you ever got excited about at Grandma's. It started with fresh leaf lettuce, maybe from the backyard, torn, not chopped, and laid into a big wooden bowl. Then came the hot bacon dressing, smoky, salty grease still sizzling in the pan, poured over vinegar, sugar, and a touch of mustard until it hissed and thickened. When she poured it over the greens, you could actually hear them sigh and shrink. No crunchy croutons or bottled ranch, just that sharp, smoky dressing clinging to every leaf. The onions turned soft, the lettuce darkened, and suddenly a salad tasted like something forbidden. You were not supposed to like greens this much, but this was different. It was rich, nostalgic, the opposite of diet food. Grandma never served it on holidays, just on quiet nights when she had leftover bacon. It tasted like a secret passed down through cast iron. Boiled hot dogs were a staple, but when Grandma cut them into spirals and fried them, that was art. She would grab a butter knife and start carving lazy spirals down each dog, a quiet rhythm that signaled something better than a plain bun and ketchup situation. Into the pan they went. No oil, just heat and a watchful eye. They'd twist open like little red flowers, crisping on the edges and curling into bite-sized perfection. No bun, no mustard, no fuss. Just a fork, a paper plate, and maybe a slice of white bread on the side. She called it fancy, and you believed her. You still do. Somehow they tasted smokier, saltier, more alive than the boiled kind. Grandma made something magical from the barest pantry. It was the kind of food you forgot how much you loved until the first bite brought it all back. No restaurant could ever make it right. Canned fruit cocktail was an event, but only if you got the cherry. Grandma would crack open the can, drain half the syrup, and scoop it into a chipped glass bowl with the grace of a maitre d'. The peaches were soft, the pears mushy, and the grapes strangely firm, but everyone was watching for that one red cherry. There was only ever one. You watched with bated breath as her spoon danced through the syrup. Sometimes she saw your eyes and gave it to you on purpose. Sometimes she did not. But when you got it, it felt like a prize. That maraschino orb, glowing like a ruby in a sea of beige. The rest of the fruit was fine, comforting even. But that cherry turned it into a game, a ritual, a tiny miracle. To this day, no fruit salad feels complete without it, and no bowl tastes quite like Grandma's. Cornbread crumbled into buttermilk wasn't just a snack, it was a ritual. Grandma never explained it, never altered it, never questioned it. She'd grab a cold glass or chipped bowl, tear up a wedge of cornbread with her hands, and pour buttermilk straight over it. No sugar, no salt. Just silence and spoonfuls. The bread softened instantly, soaking up the tangy milk until it looked more like pudding than anything else. You might have turned your nose up at first, but one bite made it click. It was cool, comforting, and oddly satisfying, like a food memory passed down through flavor. She'd call it supper, even though it seemed too simple. You never saw it on a restaurant menu or in a cookbook, just in her kitchen, just on ordinary days. It didn't make sense to anyone else, but in that bowl was a whole world, familiar, frugal, and made with care. Vienna sausages never got a warm-up in Grandma's house. They came straight from the can, forked out one by one onto a saucer, usually accompanied by a single sleeve of Ritz crackers and a glass of tap water. She called it a light lunch, and somehow it always was. The smell hit you first, smoky, salty, strangely metallic. And then came the texture, soft and slick, like nothing else in the fridge. But you ate them anyway because Grandma served them like they were fine appetizers. The can hissed when opened, and she always split them evenly if more than one person was there. You didn't ask what they were made of, and she didn't tell. That's just how it was. Sometimes she'd add a dab of yellow mustard or a slice of cheese if she was feeling fancy. But mostly, it was just you, her, and those little sausages in silence. Homemade egg custard in teacups felt like dessert and a ceremony rolled into one. Grandma didn't use ramekins or fancy dishes, just her mismatched collection of floral teacups, filled halfway with a pale yellow mixture that wobbled slightly when tapped. She'd pull them from the oven, their tops golden and cracked, steam rising in little curls. "Don't burn your mouth," she warned every time, but you always did. The first spoonful was thick, silky, and sweet, with just a hint of nutmeg sprinkled on top. There was something timeless about the texture, like it belonged in a different century. No whipped cream, no caramel drizzle, just egg, sugar, milk, and thyme. You never asked for it, but she always made it anyway, usually on rainy afternoons when nothing else was planned. It didn't come from a box. It came from memory, and it tasted like something that should never be forgotten. Syrup sandwiches were Grandma's secret fix for everything from scraped knees to bad report cards. She'd reach for a loaf of soft white bread, slather on a thick layer of margarine, and then drizzle syrup, usually corn, sometimes cane, until it pooled at the edges. The second slice sealed it in like a sugary envelope. She never cut the crusts, never needed to. It was sticky, messy, and nearly impossible to eat without licking your fingers. But it hit like a hug from the inside out. It didn't matter if there wasn't much else in the kitchen. This was the kind of comfort that cost pennies but felt priceless. It was sweet, soft, and rich enough to silence whatever had gone wrong that day. You could taste the kindness in every bite, even if it stuck to the roof of your mouth. It wasn't dessert, it was medicine, Grandma style. Mystery casseroles were Grandma's wild card dinner move, and you never really wanted to know what was inside. Could have been canned tuna, leftover chicken, some cream of something soup. Who's to say? But the potato chip topping was always the giveaway. She'd crush them by hand, straight from the bag, scattering the crumbles like golden confetti across the top before sliding it into the oven. The smell was comforting, vaguely familiar, and just enough to distract you from asking questions. When it came out bubbling, that crispy top made it all okay. You picked around the unknown bits at first, but eventually gave in, because it always worked. It was salty, creamy, hot, and full of some strange kind of love. Grandma never wrote it down. She just said, "Use what you got." You still don't know what you were eating half the time, but you'd eat it again, every last bite. Two aspects of the 1950s that are largely forgotten were ducklings and roasts. These concepts had a perfect marriage in one recipe, and that was cranberry orange roast ducklings. It was a really celebratory dish, the kind of thing you would roll out for big days and events, maybe a birthday, maybe a holiday dinner. Either way, it was a recipe that utmost home chefs and grandmothers really kept close to their hearts. They even passed it down in family cookbooks for generations, so go figure. One of the best things about this dish was also its use of cranberries, which are particularly a holiday season favorite in America. The ducklings were used for their tender meat, and the roasting was done to give it some crispy skin and juicy meat. This was one savory dish that also used a lot of sweeteners on top of the already zest-filled oranges. It used things like maple syrup and honey, and this was actually done so that the cranberries wouldn't be too overbearing. You had to be pretty thorough with the prep work here, which is why it was a dish that veteran grandmothers excelled in. Golden syrup is this really thick sugar syrup that is pretty accurately named because, wow, this thing has a vibrantly strong amber hue. That kind of fits the taste of the syrup too. When I see amber-colored things, especially sweet ones, my mind goes straight to caramel. Does that happen for you too? We'd both be right though, since the syrup was caramel-flavored. It also had a sweetener that really sealed the whole deal together, wrapped in a neat little bow. You could use this for so many things, like making your porridge a bit more lively with this, adding it to desserts for some extra oomph, or using it as a drizzle over buttermilk pancakes. The possibilities covered breakfast, lunch, and dinner, so you can see why every boomer's home had this in their pantry. A lot of easy and no-fuss baking recipes like flapjacks and tarts were pretty much reliant on this syrup, and for good reason too. This thing really tasted amazing. Pot roasts have been as much a part of the grand scheme of American culture and cuisine as anything else on this dish, and each area, state, and neighborhood has their own ideas of what one should look like. Were you the kind of kid that grew up on beef chuck roast, potatoes, a beefy broth, and carrots in your roast? Maybe you had boneless chuck roast, olive oil, bay leaves, and stuff like that instead. These are just the few variations you can expect to find when it comes to a good, well-done pot roast. The perfect party snack or a great one to pull out for an incredibly large family dinner with the in-laws and extended family, this is one dish that never fails to pull through, especially when a seasoned cook is behind it. Baked oysters with tasso cream is a pretty sweet dish that has the best of a lot of things. You have the brine of a well-baked oyster, but tasso ham on its own is a world apart from the typical ham flavor you're used to. These are both things you would usually find in Southern traditions and Creole cuisine, and it's one of those family-preserved recipes that grandmas passed down. The kind of thing they only teach you when they know you're ready and won't mess it up. The fresh oysters are actually baked in their shells, which is just a little bit away from convention. Then they get topped with a sauce that's been mixed in with the tasso ham, and that really rounds off the flavor profile here. You have lots of sweet notes with smoky aftertastes, and it makes it nearly irresistible. The sauce also makes a lot of use of shallots and paprika, plus a decent amount of butter, cream, and cheese. Overall, this is one of the best things we've salvaged from the nearly ineligible diaries of grandmas active in the 1950s. It's definitely a national treasure for seafood lovers. If you think oysters are your thing, then this is one recipe you have to try. If you do, share your experience down below. Speaking of how different things were in their time due to the economical strife, one thing that got really popular back when your grandparents were still young was sausage gravy and biscuits. This might seem like an outlandish combo to us today, and we admit it takes a bit of getting used to, but the magic is all in the gravy. Biscuits and gravy are already something Americans have been pretty accustomed to eating, especially in the 20th century, but innovation is one of the finer points of the country, and culinary matters are no exception. People eventually found out that using pork sausage crumbles enriched the gravy and made it irresistible, especially if they were smoked. Usually, biscuits like jumbo buttermilk ones make for a great side to the dish, but even the gravy alone was worth eating on its own. Crown roast of lamb is a spectacular dish that is pretty much only reserved for main course purposes. You could call this the most valuable player on a menu or the main character, and you wouldn't be wrong. It's a traditional dish that's, by custom, preserved usually for holiday feasts and big celebrations. So it works in a funny way too. You take 2 racks of lamb and tie them together in the shape of a circle. Now the crown bit comes from how they're arranged this way with their bones exposed, kind of looking like a skeletal crown. Makes it a great dish for Halloween. The rib bones are also usually Frenched, which means the meat's removed. They're also dolled up, and by that I mean most traditional recipes ask you to throw in some decor by putting paper frills on those rib bones. Maybe that's not exactly up your alley, but it adds to the fact that this is a festive dish. It's not really light on the seasoning either, or the stuffing, both of which it uses in extreme amounts. You end up roasting the lamb and serving it with potatoes. It's a delicious dish that fetches a high price outside the home and takes a lot of work if you're making it from scratch, but is usually worth it. Spaghetti, canned or dried, was just as available as hot dogs were, and equally in style. Again, we have to thank Chef Boyardee for doing community service on a national scale with these. Pre-cooked, tomato-based spaghetti for a few cents, canned and fresh. This is what modernization is all about. What's the point of all this fancy tech if we can't make eating food twice as easy as it usually is? Plus, you were getting some pretty good spaghetti. There were lots of concerns among new customers when this first dropped, because if something's mass-produced, it's likely that they're cutting corners somewhere or adding something to it in the name of additives and preservatives. But here, What you saw is what you got. It really is just spaghetti that could work for children or adults. People could have a cute date night at home with some spaghetti or feed their crying children immediately, and both would work. Chef Boyardee's was really the most popular pick by far for any kind of spaghetti-based dish, though. Out of all the canned spaghetti you could get, it was only Boyardee's that would have that perfect consistency. It wasn't overly tomato-y, not was it too creamy. The sauce wasn't thin, it knew how to do just enough, not too much or too little. You could reheat this in a microwave if you had one, or just pop open the stove and you'd be ready to eat a pretty serviceable plate of spaghetti. Plus, those bright red Chef Hector Boiardi pictures really worked wonders for the packaging. Just caught your eye in a store like nothing else. Would that work on you today, though? Or are we feeling lighter colors with packaging nowadays? A recipe that is largely forgotten right now but still made some noise back when it was really popular in the 20th century is shrimp and grits. The secret to an incredible plate of these was all in the milk, butter, and cheddar cheese. Depending on the quality and how you handled it, you would ever have shrimp that had not really absorbed the flavor or the best seafood experience you could hope to have at home. Luckily, over many long years, the home cooks of our nation perfected the recipe and kept passing it down, one generation to the next. Some chopped bacon for a smoky flavor, or sausage drippings were also really popular picks for older chefs to run with. Grits would be made with dent corn and often boiled, then mixed with the butter and milk. How did your family make these, if they ever did? One of the best examples I have of beans being the phenomena they were is 3-bean baked beans. Yes, this was a dish that consisted entirely of different kinds of beans, and it is actually so much better than you're thinking. This variation was kind of like a bean casserole, and it was made using 3 different kinds of typical southern beans. You would have your pinto or navy beans, and then for protein, texture, and firmness, you would add kidney beans. Then, butter beans and or lima beans would work for flavor and as a topping, and you were pretty much ready to go. Once you had layered your dish, all you had to do was bake it. This was one of the best ways to get a lot of protein into your diet while keeping everyone full. It was one of the most nostalgic dishes that the working class of that generation ever had, and it was something that loads of people grew up with, myself included. There was nothing like coming home to the scent of grandma making fresh baked beans and leaving no stone unturned in terms of effort and preparation. Plus, it would usually go extremely well with barbecue and steaks. Now, who can go without some canned salmon? Funny enough, it's crabs and salmon that are actually some of the most expensive seafood you can get in the modern world. Back in the time of our boomer parents, they were such common catches thanks to the ever-so-lively fishing industries that it was impossible to spend a day without smelling some salmon down the block, especially if you were living in coastal cities. Pretty much everyone in those areas relied exclusively on meats like this to get by, and they had the nicest ways of preparing them too. You'd never get a bad bloat going that would make you want to stay indoors off of steamed or grilled salmon with rice. Plus, it helped that back then, we were still very much into exploring what other people and communities were cooking. So there were all these different ways of making salmon that never crossed anyone's mind before. People were suddenly experimenting, and there was enough of the stuff to go around. You've heard of buying store-bought pies and getting up to a serious baking session. Let me introduce you to canned and frozen pies, which were savory delights that were filled with meat. Usually, you'd get more beef and chicken than you bargained for with these, but sometimes they'd come in fruity flavors too, because towards the end of the boomer generation, plant-based and vegan eating was starting to pop off. It was really a wonderful time when this first dropped, though. People were suddenly starting to have their most favorite comfort food available to them in the most convenient ways. Going to the store to pick up a pie was a treat, in more ways than one. It was nice to have something so familiar on hand like that. Southern skillet cornbread has been a beloved memento of the South for many decades to the rest of the nation, but in the area, it is a tradition that goes back all the way to the 18th century. History books tell us that it comes from Native American cuisine, and it makes sense since a lot of Native American cuisine was very cost-effective. It is kind of everything you would want in a home-cooked meal, easy on the wallet, simple ingredients you can find at any nearby store, and little prep time. which means you can get your cravings fulfilled immediately. Plus, most cooks back then were so accustomed to it from a lifetime of making cornbread in these cast iron skillets that they could make it much faster than even an experienced cook. Guess experience counts for something, especially when you have 40 to 50 years of it, right? So chicken and andouille gumbo was a pretty cultural recipe that was unique to some parts of the South. It was supposed to be one of those dishes that would keep most of the work to just one pot. It was also one of the few things around that used okra, and that really made it a novelty at first. This recipe really makes extreme use of the andouille, which is a French sausage that first got its start in Normandy. The key trick here is that it's usually made with all kinds of flavorings. Now, in the land of the French, you could go up to a butcher's shop and ask for wine sausage without it being a freak conversation. In Louisiana, though, not so much. When the first French immigrants eventually came here and started to spread the roots of their cuisine, they adapted a lot of recipes to suit the American markets and butcher shops. This meant using sausages and substituting those traditional flavors of home with things like cayenne and smoking the sausages a lot more than you normally would. Gumbo, on the other hand, is a dish right out of the heart of African traditions in a variety of cultures. It's a stew that got really popular in Louisiana, and for good reason. The combo with andouille was lethal, as the spicy sausage worked perfectly with the rich and vibrant flavors of gumbo. Thanks to the Depression, one of the biggest habits that stuck around with people was the idea of adding beans to almost everything. Remember how I told you that all things gelatin were becoming increasingly popular? Kelly's ham Jell-O salad is a wonderful showing of that. It shows you how much fun people wanted to have in the 20th century with their food, and I think I know why. After decades of rationing and only making the most practical, frugal, budget-saving meals people could think of, I think it was extremely cathartic letting their culinary creativity loose and trying all sorts of new wacky combinations. This ham Jell-O salad actually managed to stick to the wall rather than miss, because it did extremely well at potlucks, family events, and all kinds of parties. It was a molded gelatin dish that used shredded ham and ingredients like pineapples and olives in a molded gelatin base. I know that just sounds like the most random assortment of ingredients ever. I mean, seriously, ham with olives? Pineapple? Celery? Who thought of this? I need to thank them. I never knew these ingredients could work so well with each other, and I don't think a lot of people would have known that fact either if not for this salad. As far as all the crazy gelatin-based dishes go, this is definitely one of the significantly more memorable ones to come out of the decade. It's sad that it pretty much faded with the generation of boomers that would take the time to prepare it, though. Pineapples were starting to grow outside of Hawaii, and dare I say they built up a pretty serious fan base for themselves over the years. The PR here was insane. They went from being a fruit that people thought was only good in the summers to suddenly being featured with pizzas, sandwiches, fish, and God knows what else. You had pineapple upside-down cakes, or pineapples and ham, or even sweet and sour pork. The list was endless. This was a complete 360 from its usual position in the culture too, and it was really sudden. By the way, the 350 thing wasn't a pun, because you know the pineapples came in round 360-degree rings. Anyway, moving on. My personal theory is that the pricing and the need for cooler foods that broke away from the typical trends of savory, warm, and spicy were becoming more and more necessary. And, well, the people spoke for themselves and with their wallets. A big block to mass pineapple consumption was also that cracking one open simply took more effort than a lot of people were willing to spare for a tropical fruit they only kinda enjoyed. It's the same deal as people who don't bother with crab because it's just a pain to break open the legs to scoop a little bit of meat. Luckily, canned pineapples were the final nail in the coffin for complaints like that, because now you could just pop open a can and begin snacking away. No arrangement, tools, or slicing and dicing needed. Now, mashed potatoes and gravy need no introduction or explanation. Everyone and their mother's mother has had it. But did you know how good they were at making it? Receiving this dish from the chefs of generations ago was an entirely different experience in comfort. We do not know what spices they would mix, as each area had its own variations, with some even using mushrooms. Most popular was coriander, thyme, black pepper, and some oregano. The gravy would even put KFC to shame, if we are being completely honest. You just did not feel like eating from the outside when you had such fine dining available at home, and it was the perfect thing to get you back up only our feet from an exhausting day. If we move on over to the kids' menu for a second, we'll find alphabet spaghetti, every boomer parent's dream food. The dish was simply canned tomato sauce pasta, but the pasta spelled out the alphabet. It's a little educational, a little tasty, and pretty cheap. Its best quality is easily that it could be paired with a number of things like toast, ham, or sausages, and you could even mix some peas and corn in there for a bit of a nutritional kick. It was a favorite for families with lots of children, and back in the day, that was pretty much every family. Hooray for Planned Parenthood, I guess. You could also serve it up plain as it is, but that was more for kids that had already acquired a finer palate, which happily included pasta. Most kids were still eating mud from the playground, really. The playful shapes and vibrant sauce weren't just meals, they were fun on a plate. Parents loved how easy it was to prepare, especially after a long day, and kids were entertained while eating. It wasn't uncommon for families to turn dinner time into a mini spelling game, laughing at the words the spaghetti created. For parents looking to stretch their budget, these cans were lifesavers. They packed enough carbs to keep growing kids full and satisfied. Plus, it made vegetables like peas and corn just a little more bearable for picky eaters. This quirky meal became a symbol of simpler times, where dinner didn't need to be fancy to be memorable. Here is a dish that you have probably heard of one too many times but never gotten enough of: meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Let's just say that comfort cooking really does not get much higher than this, nor more relaxing. Sitcoms, movies, and comedies across the decades that depict middle-class families always have somebody serving up a killer meatloaf, and it is for good reason. Our generation's parents always grew up eating a hearty meatloaf with a side of perfectly mushy soft potatoes, so it is no wonder that they kept the custom going. Today, mashed potatoes have an 85% popularity rate, which even beats hamburgers and cheeseburgers. You would think that those would be America's top one, but it seems nothing can beat Grand's meatloaf classics. By the 1950s, though, people were becoming aware of the lifestyle choices they were continuously making and how that was affecting things like their gut health. All the years of grills, wings, and casseroles take a toll on you. Still, it was hard for America to move on to no-protein salads that consisted almost entirely of Ivy League superfood vegetables like kale and broccoli. A better place to start the meat-addled population off was ham salad. This tangy, creamy salad involved a lot of diced ham blended with mayonnaise, mustard, pickles, onions, and just about every other familiar crutch you would need to get you into the habit of eating a salad. It wasn't the healthiest one, so to speak, but it was definitely a lot tastier and easier to swallow. Plus, you could throw in some croutons for some real fun and actually get to enjoying your salad. It was inexpensive too, since a lot of these vegetables aren't really ones that sink their teeth into your wallet. Ham is also one of the most common things in anyone's pantry, so it didn't take a lot to get familiar with this recipe. Deviled ham is pretty much exactly what you're used to seeing. The finest ham you've ever seen in a can, minced to perfection and blended with just the right amount of mustard, spices, and seasonings. You can make sandwiches out of this or use it as a spread, but beyond that, it's not really something you could do too much with it. It's one of those canned foods that doesn't really have much in terms of variety, but does excel at what it does, so we'll give it a pass. You could get it for 20 cents or just a few more, but if you really wanted ham heaven in a can, then the obvious pick was Underwood. This was arguably the most dominating brand and helped every grocery store drive its sales up for the month. Not to mention, it was responsible for a lot of ham sandwiches. People swore by its versatility, often packing it into school lunches or smearing it on crackers for an easy appetizer at home parties. Deviled ham's spicy kick gave it a unique edge, making it a favorite for picnics and road trips too. Housewives appreciated how long it lasted on the shelf, giving them a quick fix for surprise guests or after-school snacks. And who could forget the iconic devil logo on the packaging? It became a recognizable staple in American households, a small but satisfying indulgence that offered the flavor of home-cooked ham without all the effort. You know how boomers love a good low-effort food. Deviled ham may not have been the star of gourmet cuisine, but it was undeniably a reliable classic. Beef stew is a nostalgic childhood dish nobody can go without. Fresh pearl onions and a broth made out of the beef stock were the tricks to an unbeatable stew that is sorely missed every time you eat one that is not your grandma's. The modern-day beef stew involves an entire list of 10 ingredients for better readability that feels more like an overdone broth mixed with a lot of toppings. But that is because beef stews have gone a bit out of fashion unless you are in the South. This is also because beef stews today are usually made with red wine as a base. But the hearty and vigor-filled ones of your childhood were all about keeping it simple with vegetables and a solid cut of beef. Country Captain Chicken, on the other hand, has some roots that go right back to the spice trade between India and America during the 18th and 19th centuries. It was apparently a British recipe that was made using Indian inspirations, and the term country captain was pretty much used by sailors back then to refer to Indians who were landholders. It was extremely common in Georgia and South Carolina, and it was one of the very first examples we have of real fusion food. Country Captain Chicken itself is a curry stew that has boned chicken, lots of bell peppers, an extreme amount of garlic, and just a touch of curry powder here and there. Then, you put in some raisins and dried fruits for some additional firmness and sweetness, and you're pretty much good to go. In the South, this was a massively celebrated dish. It even had fans up in the White House, as reportedly, Franklin Roosevelt and George Patton were apparently big fans of the dish. It's one of the earliest examples of American cuisine that has a midway point between American, British, and Indian influences. And it didn't take a long time for this dish to spread outside of the South, too. If you really want to go the retro route, then you can't go without exploring all the gelatin madness that took over the 50s. It was a big trend, too, especially with your salads. Canned sweet corn was pre-cooked and packed with brine and water, but it had this really soft and crunchy texture and also a natural sweetness to it that made it almost irresistible. Seriously, you had these soft but ever so slightly firm kernels that had a wonderful crisp to them, but not as much as fresh corn does. Plus, these were already pre-cooked like almost everything on the list is, so you were free to eat them right from the get-go as soon as you got your hands on a can. Originally, I remember hearing about how people were a little distrustful of this because the color was just a bit duller than what you would get on your usual cob. It was still yellow, but it was a little paler. Your parents probably know exactly what I'm talking about. That was just a side effect of the canning, though. You could have 12 or 15-ounce cans, and they were the pride and joy of so many corn-based dishes that did the rounds in neighborhoods and community cookbooks. With these, you could make anything from buttered sweet corn to salads, fritters, or use them in casseroles. You could even bake with them. Things like corn pudding or a cheesy corn bake were never unrealistic as long as you had the main ingredient ready to go. Plus, dealing with natural corn is a bit of a hassle. There are some baking challenges that only your grandmother is equipped for, and making the pinnacle of brown butter sweet potato pies was one of them. Seriously, even bakeries and fancy eateries have struggled to nail every aspect of a pie, but for most home chefs in the United States, it seems to be just another Tuesday with the oven. You take a flaky pie crust with a velvety potato filling that is usually topped off with whipped cream, but most older cooks preferred maple syrup as that was what they grew up with. Just a bit of dark brown sugar would elevate this dish into the perfect dessert, though it would often steal the show entirely on its own. The thing is built to make your mouth water, and we mean looks-wise too, since the brown and caramel hues of the pie just make it all the more enticing. Have you ever heard of this one before, and would you try it? For a lot of Depression-era related reasons, soup had become especially popular in America, especially cream soup, and one of the easiest ones to make was cream of celery soup. This was a traditional recipe that was popular in the South for many years. It was used to give easy nutrition to families and feed people on a budget. Both happened to be things that this recipe excelled at in particular. People would usually go extra hard on the cream to add some real texture to it, and it stopped feeling like a soup at some point with particularly cream-focused families. Still, it was good for getting some greens into people's diets, especially kids. People would typically just serve this with bread or another main course, but the dish was fine enough to eat on its own too. You might be wondering what I meant when I mentioned the Depression, though. During that entire period, and thanks to the war efforts later on too, soups and Americans had become pretty much best friends. They were one of the most convenient and healthiest ways to feed a crowd, and the acquired taste wasn't something the public was shaking off anytime soon. If any of these tasted like your childhood, then drop your favorite dish in the comments, tap that like button like it's a biscuit tin, and subscribe.